Welcome, everyone, to our latest JDCRP Reading Room. We are very excited that we will have here today from Michelle Young, who's written an extremely well-received and popular book called The Art Spy. Many of you on listening to us may know about Rose Valland, an extremely underestimated and heroic figure in the French Resistance, who was more or less the sole curator at the Jeu de Paume, spying on the Germans as often the only French person who was tolerated there. I can't say allowed, but tolerated. It's quite a fascinating story. Michelle is an award-winning journalist and author. She came to us from journalism. Um, and she has a bachelor's degree in art history from Harvard and architecture, and a master's degree in from Columbia's School of Architecture, having also studied urban planning. And she's a professor of architecture at Columbia, and she's speaking to us from Massachusetts. Her book, The Art Spy, is a finalist for the Marfield Prize, the National Award for Arts Writing, the Lambda Literary Prize, and the Massachusetts Book Award. And it's longlisted for the 2025 American Library of Paris Book Award. She, as a journalist, has had work that's appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Airmail, The Forward, Town and Country, and Narratively. And she will tell us more about what brought her to Rose Valland and to decide that this very underappreciated person, particularly in English, because until Michelle's book, there really has been very, very little done in English on Rose Valland, more in France, where she is more of a national hero, but unknown to us. So with that, Michelle, I will turn it over to you and just say to our audience, Michelle will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. Please feel free to put the questions in the chat. That's probably easier for us to manage. And then we'll get to the questions once we've heard from Michelle about how she came to write this book, what for her, what it was like to do this research, what it required in terms of resources and ingenuity, which was considerable. She spent years researching this and many trips to France, as you can imagine. And what Rose Valland at the end, and this book, what the story means for her and what it can mean for us now that we know more about it. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deirdre. Hello, everyone. It's exciting to see people from so many countries interested in this subject. I'm very honored here to be with the JDCRP, which is doing great work in the looted art field. I see some familiar names here, so that's also very exciting to see everyone. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully that successfully works. All right. Well, someone will let me know if it doesn't work. Continue to share. Okay. Well, and thank you for that prompt, Deirdre. It gives me a little sense of where we might want to go with this. I'm assuming that some people may know quite a bit about Rose Valland and some people may not know so much. So I'm going to do a bit of a mix. And then I would love for this to be quite interactive after me and Deirdre's Q&A. So do please send questions. So The Art Spy, the title of my book, which came out from HarperCollins last year in America, Canada, and the UK. The most common question I often get is, how did you even come across Rose Valland? And in the English American speaking world, as Deirdre mentioned, she was not quite well known. And so the question is, how do you discover someone that people really haven't written about? And so I discovered her in this book by Jonathan Petropoulos, Goring's Man in Paris. Some of you may be familiar with this book. Jonathan is an academic and professor at Claremont McKenna College in California, and he had personally known Goring's art dealer in Paris, a man named Bruno Lose, who will turn out to be one of Rose Valland's maybe main nemesis in her time at the Jeu de Paume, but then even afterwards, they pretty much hated each other through the rest of their lives. And I actually just moderated a panel with the producers of the documentary Plunderer, which some of you may have seen on PBS. It also screened in the theaters, and this is a documentary about Lose. done by an Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker. And so in this book, which I was just reading for fun, it was every few chapters of this book, a woman named Rose Valland appeared. And I do have to pause here and say that my interest in World War II actually begins with my family's own story. In World War II, my grandfather survived the atomic bomb in Hiroshima in August 1944. And so I've always been curious about that time period. But then I married somebody French. And so really did a deep dive into the European war of during World War II, which was a great interest of mine really since junior high and high school. And I had been reading exclusively female spy World War II books in English. And so when I came across Rose, I was amazed that I hadn't heard of her. Maybe people in France would be like, "Oh no, we know about her," but for the Americans and including the fact that she had been one of the most medaled women in all of World War II and had even won the American Medal of Freedom, that surprised me. And so thus began the quest to uncover this story. Let's see here. This looks like I can't move this. Oh, great. Oh, okay, wait, hold on. I can move it by my mouse. Okay. So if you have not heard of Rose Valland before, maybe you have seen the movie Monuments Man, and there's a character based on Rose named Claire Simone, played by Cate Blanchett, very memorably. And so she appears in that. And then even earlier, you may have known a movie called The Train with Burt Lancaster. And this is a very classic Burt Lancaster caper, but a woman inspired by Rose Valland. And the story was actually optioned off of a part of her wartime memoir, became this film, but it turns into a real caper. But you do see a character based on her with, again, a different name at the beginning of the film that sets off the action. And that is surrounding this last train of art that the Nazis are desperately trying to move out of France in the days right before the liberation. And Rose, in her role in the museum at the Jeu de Paume, is trying to stop this train of art. But there's lots of explosions and train derailments, and Burt Lancaster's character falls in love with the waitress at the train station. So you get my drift. It's very Hollywood, but the fact that Rose Valland was somewhat involved in this story makes it more interesting. And I would say the movie holds up quite well. So Rose Valland is born in 1898 in this countryside village about 40 miles southeast of Lyon. And the first thing I always do when approaching any subject, be it an urban planning project, an architecture project, a journalism story, is to show up and go to where a story has taken place. So, in fact, before I had a book deal, before I had a literary agent, the first summer after I read Jonathan Petropoulos' book, I asked my husband to bring me to Saint-Étienne-de-Saint-Geois, and where Rose was born. And it was really just to get a gut sense of, is there a story to be told here? What can I uncover and poke around without doing anything formal yet? And so what I discovered was that in her hometown, there is a Place Rose Valland, a plaza for Rose, named after her. But it is sadly in the parking lot of the post office. So I joke, we need to get Rose out of the parking lot and more prominent. But I also went to the town hall to ask them if they knew anything. And I had a book by Ophélie Jouan, who's actually on the call today. So I'm very excited to see her. And there was a really great book she had put together as part of a museum exhibition, I believe, at the Museum of Resistance in Grenoble. And so through that book, I had Rose's the house she had grown up in, a picture of that, and where she was buried. And I went to the town hall after poking around and said, "Do you know where her house is? And do you know where she's buried?" I went to all 4 cemeteries. I tried to walk around and check out every tombstone, and I didn't find her. And they said, "We actually don't know anything about her. However, here's the number to an association that's for her memory in her hometown." And they gave me the phone number. So I held on to this little scrap of paper like gold, because I didn't have a project then. I didn't want to bother anybody in advance of a mythical project that hadn't come to be yet. But once I was ready to work on it, then I reached out and But on that first trip, I did discover Rose Valland's house. And so this is right off the town square. And the right side is the family quarters. And on the left is the forge. And her father actually had taken over the smithery that belonged to her mother's family. And so you can kind of imagine the world in which Rose has grown up in. There is a forge that's really open air in some areas, and you can hear iron clanging and soot falling. And um, and so yeah, this is where she's born, and then sorry, where she lived when she was younger. I met a friendly cat. So I was very pregnant with my second daughter, hence why I wasn't doing too many projects, but I wanted to dig into this story at the time. And then later you'll see I did find where she was buried as well. So here are some early photos of Rose shown to me by her family, whom I worked with to tell this story. And Rose, unlike a lot of women growing up in the Gilded Age period, she has a mother who intently wants to have her educated. And I live now in Massachusetts, close to the home of Edith Wharton, a very famous writer, American writer, but who lived in France for the latter part of her life. And Edith Wharton was born into one of the wealthiest families in America, but her mother was horrified that she wanted to read and horrified that she wanted to be educated. So it was very unusual for someone like Rose coming from the working class to have had the education that she had. And so from an early age, her mom applies for her to get scholarships, to go to better schools. And so in her early teens, she goes to a boarding school not too far from home. In her high school years, she's at the Teachers College in Grenoble. For the Americans here, college is equivalent to high school in France. So that's during the World War I years, and she excels there. And then she goes to the École des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, where she wins awards from the school level all the way to the state, the federal level. And then she goes to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which requires a 40-hour test in order to get in. And she does very well there. And these are photos from the 1920s when Rose is studying in Paris. And so after or during the time period that she's at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, she's also taking courses at a variety of other schools, including the École du Louvre in Paris. And so here is where she meets one of her early nemesis, we might be able to say. And he seems to have taken a disliking to her. And I really wanted to understand Henri Verne quite specifically, because when you read the letters, and one of them is also in Ophélie Jouan's book that's reproduced there, he goes to quite a level to later essentially thwart her opportunities to get a job after she graduates from the École du Louvre. And I really wanted to understand this. So Henri Verne at the time is at the head of not only the École du Louvre, where Rose is studying, which is teaching future art historians and curators, but also all of the Louvre and all of the French National Museum. So he's quite powerful. He's a powerful civil servant in France. And when I looked back at his educational background, it turns out that he had never studied the arts formally. He had a degree in literature and the law. They were decent degrees for his time period, but he seems very intent on proving that and establishing that he is a man of the arts, a man of letters. And so he does extensive publications in the arts. And in 1939, which we will kind of get to that point, but just as a note, but in 1939, the year before he's scheduled to retire from the École du Louvre, he's actually teaching 19 courses there. And as a professor myself, I don't even know how you can teach 19 courses at the same time. So anyhow, Rose unfortunately has Henri Verne as one of her thesis readers, and he gives her a very middling grade on her thesis, which is about the movement of Italian art from the Renaissance to the present day, and deems her subject not art history at all. Which is very funny, because when I was at Harvard, I wanted to do my thesis on the study of fashion design. as shown from Greek vase painting and that time period all the way potentially to the present day. And I was looking at its influence on the fashion designers of Dior and stuff in the 50s and 60s. And I was also told that this was not art history. So it's one of the many points in which I felt a certain kinship with Rose, even though we come from totally different time periods and totally different places in life and completely different countries. And another funny moment was I met a very notable professor at Williams College who told me that she experienced the same thing in the 70s when she was at Yale. She was told that her degree was also not, her thesis was also not art history. So I guess there's a continuity in when there is an establishment and powers that be, and when there is something a little more avant-garde, it can be, there can be some gatekeeping. And the 1920s is also a time period that is very vibrant in Paris. It is known, quote unquote, as the lesbian capital of Europe during this time. And Rose is in the midst of all of that. She is, we don't believe, fully out of the closet, but she is lesbian, and she does meet the woman who becomes her life partner by the end of the 1920s, and by the mid-30s, they are living together. This is her life partner, Joyce, here, this really stunning, beautiful woman. She is British, but half German. And in the process of working this book, I did several interviews with Joyce's family, her niece and nephew, who had met her on many occasions in France and in England, as well as Rose's family. And so what's notable about Joyce, in addition to the fact that she's quite well educated, is that she worked for the US Embassy. And so I actually spent 4 months of the research just on Joyce. When you have someone who is not a public figure, you really have to kind of track down the most boring documents. But I wanted to understand who she was, where she came from, but also maybe piece together her and Rose's life together, which was not too much well known, and her family never really spoke about it much. Rose's family, I would say, and so I was able to uncover some new pieces through digging into U.S. Embassy documents and such. And so, getting to Rose's life in the art world. So, as I mentioned, Henri Verne, the head of the École du Louvre, gives her a bad grade. Obviously, he's not going to hire her at the Louvre. And so she is forced to knock on all possible doors to get employed. And she ends up at this museum called the Jeu de Paume Museum. It is a modern art museum just down the street from the Louvre. So in this photo, you can see the Louvre in the background. It is focused on the modern art of the international school, as they called it. So really art outside of France, and they do exhibitions by country. So the modern art of Germany, Austria, China. They even do an exhibition called 3 Centuries of American Art with MoMA in the 1930s. And actually you can find in MoMA's documents how Rose was very directly involved in planning that exhibition specifically. And so she arrives here as an unpaid secretary because she does have this very difficult time finding a job. Her boss, André Deserrois, is a World War I aviation hero, and befitting of his social class, he's what we would call hobnobbing around the world, looking for objects to add to the permanent collection, but also arranging and figuring out what temporary exhibitions by country will be. So he's often away. He's also often ill. So Rose essentially runs the show. She knows intimately how this museum works. And this in the center is her boss, and then Rose on the left as they're preparing for an exhibition at the Jeu de Paume. And to give you some idea of what was in the permanent collection of the museum, these are some paintings that were here. So Winslow Homer's Summer Night, Mary Cassatt's Mother and Child, Alfred Stevens' Chant Passionné, Picasso, a non-cubist Picasso, and some additional photos of Rose in the museum. So you get an idea of the scale of things that could be curated here. This is a sculptural exhibition. These are very, very tall ceilings, so these sculptures are massive. And I want to take a break here to just talk about modern art and art in the Hitler world. Maybe many of you already know about this, but just in case. And so Hitler had aspired to be an artist and had gone to Vienna and had tried to be accepted into the Vienna School of Fine Arts on 2 occasions, and is rejected for different reasons. One, if you look at his paintings, they are really not too interesting. And the 30s in Germany is a very, very avant-garde time. German expressionism is filling the market, and so his works are just really not up to snuff with what is going on in the zeitgeist at the moment. And the director of the school suggests that perhaps he should try to go to the architecture school instead, because his paintings are predominantly filled with buildings. But unfortunately, he cannot go to the architecture school because he actually never formally graduated high school, in spite of his father. His father had told him he would never be an artist, and so he kind of threw away his studies. And so he spends what he describes as a very, very painful, difficult time in Austria after his mother dies, and he's been rejected from school. And so he's sleeping on park benches, he's sleeping in homeless shelters, and he's making what he calls derivative postcards, artworks for tourists. And this is where he starts to formulate his very virulent anti-Semitic creeds. And you can read this in Mein Kampf, but essentially he looks around and he believes that the art world in Vienna is controlled by a so-called Jewish cabal that's keeping him out of his true calling. And so he says he's seeing this in not just arts, but in literature, theater, in writing. And so thus begins his hatred of the Jewish population. And he also specifically hates modern art, because if you look at his artwork again, it's very representational, and he really struggles to understand anything non-representational. And sorry, wrong direction. And so when the Nazi Party comes to power in around 1932 and 33, he gives the museum curators in Germany 4 years to rid themselves of modern art. And so some follow and some don't. But 4 years later, in 1937, he orders for the seizure of all the modern art left in German and in German museums, and curates an exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Tarte Kunst. This opens around this one day different from a new museum called the House of German Art, which is to show the great German art across epochs as a counterpoint to the so-called degenerate artwork. And so, but it turns out that this degenerate art exhibition is so popular, it goes on tour in Germany for several years, and millions of people see this. And so I have some chapters in the book about this, and about Hitler's appointment of a man named Hans Posse to become curator. And here is the art exhibition on tour. And so again, the counterpoint, the House of German Art opens, Hitler tours it, but it turns out to be not too popular. And so amongst the around 15,000 works of art that the Germans seize, the modern art from the museums, the cream of the crop goes on auction in Lucerne in 1939. And so I have a chapter also dedicated to this specific event, because it's really a who's who of the art world who comes to this auction in Lucerne. And so you have a critic of art news, you have MoMA there secretly. They've appointed someone to buy art for them, but to say that they had bought it in New York. Instead, you have many curators from museums all over Europe. There are fewer curators from France, because the art dealer Paul Rosenberg has warned everyone that anything purchased from this auction will come down on our heads, was his quote, in the form of bombs. But it becomes a kind of a flashpoint moment, because you had to really make a decision on moral grounds. Do you come and buy art that might be destroyed, or do you boycott it because you know that the profits will go into the coffers of the Nazi Party? And so each person and group who attended really justified it in different ways. The American newspaper magnate Joseph Pulitzer Jr. came and bought a Matisse and some other sculptures and other works. So those remain actually in the St. Louis Art Museum to this day. And I have a secondary storyline in this book of Paul Rosenberg, who I just mentioned, and his family. And Paul Rosenberg is the exclusive art dealer to Picasso, Matisse, Braque, Marie Laurencin, Leger. So a very, very important figure in the art world, not just in France, but also in America. And so as war's breaking out, he's actually working on a Picasso retrospective with Alfred Barr at the Museum of Modern Art. And his son, Alexander Rosenberg, is really just a late teenager when the war breaks out, but ends up fighting for de Gaulle. And so it was very important for me in writing this book, which is in the narrative nonfiction genre, which means it needs to read like a novel, but everything is true and sourced. I wanted people to really understand, readers to understand the human toll of art looting on the Jewish population, but I wanted to use one family to really represent that. And I wanted to also show the wider war that's happening outside of Rose's spying inside the museum. And so with Paul Rosenberg, the Nazis were, for years, were searching for his art collection. He had wisely spread it out and moved into different places, not because he thought that the Germans and the Nazis were going to steal it, but because he wanted it to be out of harm's way. In Paris, would certainly be in some line of fire. And he also had a gallery in London, fortunately. And so actually one of the fun things that I tracked down was the fact that Paul Rosenberg had bought Van Gogh's Starry Night and had moved it to England instead of his Paris gallery. And I think only because of that do we have this painting in MoMA today, and it could have possibly potentially have been destroyed, and we wouldn't have known about Starry Night at all, because that painting had been in private hands since it had been painted. And so it was not famous before the kind of mid-century era. And so once again, poking around in my kind of firsthand research, this is the home of the Rosenberg family, and the gallery, their gallery was on the first 2 floors. It was in Paris, 21 Rue La Boétie. That's my husband there driving me around in a scooter throughout this process. And I was able to go inside and be taken around and shown the different places inside this. But some historic photos, this is what it would have looked like when you entered Paul Rosenberg's gallery. This is the foyer that led to galleries. So this is one of them, a light-filled gallery in which he put modern artworks. And then if he felt that a customer was a little skittish about investing in modern art, he would take them upstairs into another gallery where there would be impressionist works and others that were more of the mainstays and more of the safe purchases. This staircase filled with art is actually part of the family's personal quarters. And so you get a sense of just how art infused this world was. I'll probably speak for another 5 minutes and then we'll go into the conversation. But Rose Valland, so she's working in the Jeu de Paume Museum. She's unpaid as a secretary. It's very difficult in the French civil service to be transformed from a secretary into a curator or anything else. And I had interviewed people in the civil service to really understand and explain to the American readers the difficulty she faced, because it's kind of a very specific French thing. And but she a new director, assistant director, deputy director comes into the museum in the mid 1930s. His name is Jacques Joujat, and he too comes from the working class. And he gets put in charge of the plan to protect the artwork in case of a future war. And so him and Rose become, in some ways, like co-conspirators. I think he sees something in her that's familiar to him, similar to him. He knows she's an operator and very knowledgeable in the art fields, and so she becomes a pretty integral part, at least in relation to the Jeu de Paume Museum, in the protection of art in France. And so part of the larger plan is to find depositories for the art. So they're going to move and protect the most important works of art in all of the French national museums and move them to hiding places throughout France. And so they're looking for large castles and other facilities that can house the artwork and the art treasures of France. And so here's an example of Rose's notes. This is a priority list she made about the artwork that she believes should be protected in case of a war. And so she's listing here the paintings by school. So some of the ones I showed you are on this. And these lists are changing constantly. So through the 30s, she's making new lists and they're determining what's in priority, what can be protected on site and doesn't need to be moved, etc. And then as war is approaching, and there's a lot of uncertainty in France and in Europe, we see in Rose's letters her writing to her very close cousin in her hometown about what's happening in Paris. And I love this quote: "This Hitler turns out to be very tiring." It gives us a sense that she did have a sense of humor. When people kind of describe her today, they usually describe her as very serious. And she was in some aspects, but you can see from her personal letters this emergence of, well, definitely personality, but also a sense of humor. And the protection of art included moving paintings like the Mona Lisa, which got like a special custom-made crate and was in velvet. This is where she was removed from. And you get a sense from these photos just the scale of art protection that was necessary. The Venus de Milo, the Victory of Samothrace, all of this needed to be taken down. I love this photograph of one of the history paintings in the Louvre, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, because if you can see here, the man in the center, he's actually smoking a cigar. And so we were worried about art being destroyed by the Germans, but maybe not so much the risk of fire. And once again, the scale of the evacuation and the resources that were needed to protect the artwork. And once war broke out, actually, there were 2 convoys of dozens of trucks that left the Louvre every day, going to the Loire Valley and other places south. And it wasn't just artwork from the museum, it was actually personal collectors were giving their artwork temporarily to the Louvre for safekeeping. So these were Jewish families, but also artists. So Monet's family gave art to the Louvre for protection. So did Leger himself. And you can see this in all the records in the French archives. And they all went here, Chateau de Chambord, to be sorted. And some got stored here, and then others got moved on to other locations. And I guess I could keep on going forever, but before we get to questions, Rose, she has a very harrowing escape, leaving Paris when the Germans arrive in June 1940. It was a very exciting and interesting chapter to write and to research and to get enough sources to really make it come alive. There is a chapter of Rose's book, which did not get published, which recounts this. And once again, Ophelia actually helped me find another version of that. And so I found like multiple versions of this chapter lying around in different archives in France. But what's interesting about when you write something in the narrative nonfiction way is that I was excited to find this chapter. But in the end, it actually wasn't enough to tell the story. So I had to track down and hope that there might be someone else who may have recounted their escape by boat from Paris, which is a very unusual way to have left Paris during the occupation. But she returns to Paris in this less than a month later, essentially. And what I love is that she actually writes that she's bored. And like, who would be bored under Nazi occupation? But Rose Valland is bored. But a few months after that, in the fall of 1940, the museum she's working at, the Jeu de Paume, is taken over by the Nazis, their looting force, the ERR, the Einsatzreichsleiter Rosenberg, as a sorting facility and documentation area for all the art they are stealing from Jewish family collections. And so she becomes this witness to the theft, which I think you are all here because you're interested in the subject of Nazi looted art. And what's interesting from her notes is that first, you really see her trying to figure out who are the characters. She's listening phonetically to the German. So things are not spelled correctly. But over time, you can see this confidence grow, and she's understanding more. And she is documenting who's coming into the museum, what collections are being dropped off, where are these collections going, and there's a detail to the collections, the size of the paintings, the names of the artists, etc. And later, all of her intelligence she entrusts to a Met Museum curator named James Rormer, who is part of the monuments officers. And it's her information that enables them to track down where the looted art has been moved to in France. Some of the exciting things that Rose did inside the museum include stealing documents from waste paper baskets, duplicating keys to safes, stealing photo negatives and having them reproduced. And so those photographs of the artwork and the men and women who worked in the museum on the German side were also given to the monuments officers. And this is just photos of some of the Ausweises that I took pictures of in various archives. This is what enabled Rose to be in this museum. And there was an agreement between the Germans and Vichy France, which was still in charge of the museums following the armistice, that they could use the Jeu de Paume Museum, but they would have to have someone in the museum who could make a duplicate inventory of everything that was being looted. Obviously, they don't want anyone actually making an inventory, and so she's prevented from doing this from day one. But she's allowed to stay because of this like tenuous agreement that exists. And these are an example of some of the notes she took and reported to Jacques Jaujard, who was a member of the resistance. So he would have potentially taken some of these documents and sent them on, or just kept the record of them. So on the left is a visit from Marshal Goring. On the right is actually the incident about the train. So those letters and numbers you see are train numbers of that last train of art that's leaving France. And then the bottom one is about a major event that Rose witnesses about the burning of modern art paintings inside outside the Jeu de Paume in the summer of 1943. And then some photos of the German art historians and other employees who are processing the looted art that's coming in. And then they would actually curate the museum with stolen art and stolen carpets. And oftentimes high-ranking Nazis would come in. So Hermann Goering came over 20 times or so for shopping visits to pick what he wanted. But also people like Alfred Rosenberg came by. And here are some of the Nazis who were stationed in Paris specific to the ERR and the looting operation. And here is Goering visiting the Jeu de Paume. And then this is Loza showing Matisse paintings owned by the Paul Rosenberg family for Goering's consideration. And then here is Alfred Rosenberg visiting the Jeu de Paume and touring the looting operation. And then everything that's selected would have gone into crates, put onto trucks, and brought to the train station in Paris, and then sent either on Goering's private train or other trains to Germany to be further dispersed. So maybe this is a good point to start the conversation.
Deirdre, you are on mute.
Sorry. Thank you,
Yep,
Michelle.
you. Yeah.
Thanks for halting it. There's so much more to say.
Yeah.
I know. But just to ask briefly, before we ask for other questions, what was the most challenging part of the research for you? I'm going to combine two questions just so we can get to our audience. One is, what was the most challenging, and what was the most surprising information you found out about this somewhat impenetrable personality who was not easy to approach? You told me when we talked about it before.
Well, with Rose, there's just actually an abundance of material, and it was about figuring out where it was, but also really cataloging everything. And I think it was actually less of Rose's story that was maybe the most challenging to put together, but I really wanted readers to understand why art looting was an important activity, that it was part of the Nazi ideology, and really how systematic the looting was. And so, sorry. um, so, and in order to distill all of that down to a way that is digestible for the reader, because it's really Nazi decree after Nazi decree about looting, and they're debating between each other. What can we steal? How can we justify it? Can we even move this? And that can become very bloated in terms of writing and heavy quickly. And so in a way, that was one of the most extensive things that I worked on, because you have to just understand it minutely to then explain it in a clear way. But I thought that was extremely important, because we need to understand how history unfolded in order to either prevent things from the future or just to really unpack it. And so I think one of the surprising things is connected to that, because I knew, of course, about looted art and how it had happened in World War II, but I don't think I fully understood how concerted it was. And really, like, from the moment that the Germans invaded a country and set up their government, they immediately started looting. And they had been planning this for years before. They already had lists and reports of what they wanted to steal. And then it becomes a part of what eventually is the Holocaust. It's like the early step of that, because one of the first things they do in France is say, if you own anything, I think it was more than 100,000 francs in artwork, you must come and register it at the Kommandantur. Well, what happens later is that they have to physically register themselves at the Kommandantur, but they already have where these Jewish collectors are living and such, because they've already made them. So it's like this slow process that doesn't, I think any one step doesn't seem that malicious initially, but you can see when you look at it from a distance and from so many years past, and you have all these primary documents, you can see exactly how sinister it was and how it unfolded. I mean, the other part, of course, in writing World War II and past history is you ideally want to talk to people who may have known your characters that you're writing about. But with the passage of time, there are not many people still alive. And so actually, I was supposed to meet a woman who had worked on her legacy, who had known her growing up and such, or not growing up, had known her in her lifetime. And it's just one of those really dramatic stories that, like, it's like in a movie. I'm there in the hometown to meet her, and she doesn't pick up her phone. I'm being brought by the association there, and a few hours later, she has a pulmonary embolism, and I get a message that says we may never see her again. And she doesn't die that day, but and now I'm not working on a World War II book, but it's the same. I had to reschedule an interview, and I haven't heard from that person because he said he was ill. And it's like you have to actually grab those opportunities, because from day to day, those sources may pass away, and then the rest just took like a lot of patience and concerted digging. There were some holes in her timeline in the war that were important to fill. And so one of those is that chapter about her escaping France. I first came across this chapter in a museum not related to World War II things in the middle of France. It had been kind of reproduced and just put there. And then I found the other versions of this draft of that chapter. And then another big moment was about the fire, the burning of the paintings in the Tuileries that Rose witnessed, and she had been really questioned about that account from the minute she put it into her memoir. And so that required tracking down where that doubt and that question might have stemmed from. Just like you track down any conspiracy theory or myth, you have to kind of go back in time. And I learned from that it was the Nazis in the museum who came out after the war to say, we didn't do it. Rose is making this up. But that's not enough, right? That's in narrative nonfiction writing. That tells you that that original source, that doubt, maybe should not be taken seriously because it's a biased account, but you also need actual evidence that it occurred. And so it's like you're keeping track of a lot of threads at the same time while you're working on this and hoping that, you might find that smoking gun. So those were some of the big things. I forgot what your second question was.
You covered both aspects,
Okay.
and there's many questions we're getting now. And two of them relate to what we're talking about. Why did you choose narrative nonfiction as a genre? And also, were there parts of the story you couldn't find sources on? And did you take then liberties to expand on them? And what do you do when you can't find the information?
Oh, so narrative nonfiction is a very popular genre in America. It's actually not really a genre in France. It's really interesting, just like culturally. So the idea, again, as I mentioned, reads like a novel, but it enables you to look at one aspect of someone's life or a more narrow aspect of someone's life. So it's not a biography that goes from birth to death, even though you probably do need to cover that in any book. But I was interested because also I knew American readers would be similarly interested in just the war. And there's much to be discussed about Rose's restitution work post-war. But us Americans, we like the wartime period. And I just had the hunch that, as she's a woman, she's lesbian, there must be things that that her story must necessarily be undertold in some way. So the challenge for me was, can I dig down and try to get more information to make her come to life, but just in this time period. But you can't make anything up. And I'm someone that's like very, I take that very seriously. Some other writers do not. So they take more liberties. My philosophy is that if you research hard enough and are persistent enough, usually you will find what you're looking for, whether it's from that character themselves or other people that you can track down either in their diaries or they're still alive. And that turned out to be true here. And so actually when I turned in this book, I mentioned to you earlier that I had over 2,000 notes. And my editor looked at it. She says, "You can't do that. You cannot give me 2,000 notes." And so thus began a very painful process of actually like rebuilding the notes. But what I did after was I took the extra notes that are not in the book and put that online because I feel like I've been, because I want other people to have that. And I feel like I have been the beneficiary of researchers who came before me and have had wonderful notes in their books as well. And there's no need for any of them to start from scratch. I'm happy to tell people where I found XYZ. Right. And then, so all of that are an extended endnotes if people are
very important. Thank you.
In that. Yeah.
There's several, I'm just going to ask you several at once and touch on what you think you have time of. Someone would like to know more about her post-war experience in Germany. And then there's a question about how much of the looted art was eventually returned to the owners. I think you do know more about that. And the crates that went to Germany, were the works photographed or was it only a written list made of the inventory?
Oh, okay. So Rose spends about maybe approximately 8 years in France working for the monuments officers. She is a captain in the French Army and the U.S. Army, which I think was very exciting to her. Yes. And her team, as of shortly before she left France, there's one official report that gets circulated around, and that number restituted over 60,000 works of art. But she continued working on art restitution later, and I found this like very small mention, which was exciting, is that she actually also went to work for the Rothschild Foundation at some point in the post-war time period. And so that was
a family that had been also heavily looted.
Yes. And then, so you can see in the records that there's a lot of letters between her and Jewish families. They're all very grateful for her continued work on this. There are also letters from museum curators. So she had helped get a lot of things back that are in the Invalides. So those cannons and flags. And from what I can see, she was quite enterprising and bold. And so she went into the Russian zone. She confronted Russian officers with what they had. At one point, you actually have her almost figuring out how to do a raid to remove that stuff from the some things from the Russian zone. And so it's actually a very exciting time. But from a book perspective, it was like too lengthy of a time period with kind of moments that happened. So I had considered maybe ending the book a year, maybe into her time there. But in the end, it made sense to end the book just kind of when the war ends in France.
Yeah. Someone else noted, which is helpful, that Rose Valland's own book was translated into English in 2024, but I believe that was sometime after you started your research, correct?
Yeah. So that came out, and so actually Ophélie Jouin here had translated that, so it is available. I think Rose was an academic, true and true, and to me, her book reads almost like an academic thesis. She's really wanting to make sure that, for the record, this is how looting happened, and as a warning to the future.
Yeah.
And she also served as the interrogating witness at Bruno Lose, the man in the museum, Goring's man, at his war crime tribunal in France. And so this is something, she is going to really try to push home for the rest of her life. And so it of course was a great resource, along with her drafts of the book. She cut out a lot of things. So by kind of triangulating all the different drafts, you get sometimes a bigger picture than what's on that page. So that was exciting. And yeah, for those really interested, it's definitely worth taking a look at.
Definitely. And speaking of Ophelia, she said she's very interested, particularly in your research on Joyce Hare, as that's a very little known aspect of her life.
Yeah.
And what was the turning point for you in this side quest? And she said when she spoke with the nephew in 2019, he unfortunately had very few memories of his aunt.
Yeah. So this subject really intrigued me because we have Rose, who is academic, very serious, and there aren't many I was told the family burned all the letters between her and her partner, the majority of them. There's a few that kind of ended up in other archives. But my feeling was we need to understand this relationship between the two of them in order to really understand Rose and try to bring her to life. And so I actually finished one version of the book, turned that in, and then I had time. And so that's when I started fully digging into Joyce. So I spoke to her nephew, but I also spoke to her niece, who had more memories than the nephew, but kind of collectively we had some. And so it was great to talk to them, and they give you wonderful color. One of the things they told me was that she wore these espadrille like sandals all the time. So whether she was working in the garden or going to museum exhibition, it's what she wore, right? And so I was like, that's such great color. And I started to embark on the search for boring documents, because if you have someone that is not in the public sphere, the only way you knew that they existed and that they had a life is sometimes through really boring documents, like an ID card application, a job application, I don't know, medical record, something. And so that's where I started poking into. And so one area was looking at her ID card applications, which would have listed all her different addresses. And so that's how I started to line up when approximately she would have moved into Rose's apartment. And then the other real line of inquiry, which I think is the biggest one, was the US materials. And always with this research, you just have to be like extremely persistent. So I went through every single communication in and out of the US Embassy during the war, because I knew she worked there leading up to the war, hoping to find her. So I found her listed 5 times, and I was like beyond excited, but it's just like an inventory of the communications. So then I have to go track down the originals. So, well, the first archivist at the US Archives emails me back and says, unfortunately, all those documents were burned. But because I'm like an impatient person, I think the same day I had sent my initial email, I sent a second one with like a separate question. And so a different archivist got back to me with my second email and said, here's a scan of one of the documents you're looking for. So in fact, they haven't been destroyed. So it's like I went down to the archives like that weekend and found, so that's how I understood her wartime life and her arrest, because those documents are in there.
Yeah.
And then I also later got a hold of all of her employment documents leading up. So starting in the 30s, her applications for a job, which had her CV and other things, and pieced it together from that. And the photographs that I showed you.
Yeah.
And
Great.
then later I got a hold of like all of her passports and things. But
Those are
it's like the boring documents that actually help bring someone to life.
back to life.
Sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just briefly, because we're really almost at the end, circling back to the questions about how much of the art was returned, how much of it was any of it photographed, the art?
Photographed. Well,
Yeah.
so they did photograph the things coming into the museum. They had built a Leica photo studio to document this. So, and then they had these like index cards that were like pre-formatted, which you would list, the art historians would list what the painting was, size, some art historian, well, my favorite is sometimes where they stole it from. And so these things have become very important in the restitution process. Rose's notes, these index cards, sometimes the photographs, and they all ended up in these like Nazi strongholds, castles, and things in France. So you can see photos of the monuments officers later coming across like filing cabinets of these materials. But I think what I do want to emphasize is we have records of a certain number. They say 650,000 works of art were looted in World War II. But what we have records of are the most important pieces of art, right? But when the Nazis came in and looted a gallery or looted an apartment after the family was deported, they would take literally everything, down to like the candlesticks and the napkins and such. And only the best would go to the Jeu de Paume, the artwork, the things they consider to be the most valuable. But if we consider just the scale of that theft, the 650,000 is a huge number. But what about the furniture? What about, I don't know, I think it's like, so all these numbers are necessarily, I think, underreported. The total amount, what's been recovered, what's been stolen. I do like to make sure people understand that. Like, and so I think it's believed that roughly 100,000 works of art are still remaining to be found. Again, Rose's team has
Wait, from France or in general?
In general. But the majority, not majority, that's not correct, but a large percentage of the artwork was looted from France because it was just such a repository of art collections and also the value of those. And there's some of the most important works of art were just held in France by various collectors.
Yeah, there were quite a few prestigious collectors located there. In fact, our JDCRP collectors list of persecuted Jewish collectors on the JDCRP website, the largest number were in fact in Germany of Jewish collectors, and Austria was the second largest. France came after that, but that says nothing.
Because I think the number from France is like 250,000, something like that. I think someone maybe can correct me, but I thought I'd
200. I think there were
right?
200 families.
Yeah.
Basically, whose paintings ended up in the Jeu de Paume. But as you said, that's just the top of the iceberg, so to speak.
Correct.
And the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's important to remember that this was with 6 million people murdered, millions more Jews displaced, and the property of 9 to 10 million people that was suddenly up for grabs.
Yeah.
And where is it today? The property did not disappear for the most part. Property lasts a long time.
Yeah.
So Rose did an incredible job of tracking down a lot of famous artworks that had been stolen. I mean, she found her second job in life after being a spy, I'd say.
Correct.
But there's so much out there that hasn't been identified. And even what the Allies after the war recovered and identified was sent to the country of origin, which doesn't mean that it made its way back to the original owners. That's a whole nother issue with countries throughout Europe. With objects in museums that they now claim is in the public good and they have a right of ownership. There's all kinds of fights about this, not to mention all the private ownership of looted art.
Yeah. I mean, I highly recommend everyone watch that documentary Plunderer because it's not really just about Bruno Loza, but it really
illuminates
the post-war art world from the tax code, which benefited purchasing art in America, to the restitution laws in Germany after the war, in which a lot of the artwork went back to the looters. They actually made, like Goering and other families made claims and got those paintings back. It's wild for us to think about this now because it's sort of very non-common sense. But the history of this is it's just these ups and downs. And I think we're at a really interesting stage right now where I think morality in terms of what people believe is the right thing to do, and some of the laws are getting better aligned. But for example, in the
There's a long
US,
way to go. That's for sure.
like, there's a new federal law that updated the old Holocaust law. So that was a good step. But most states don't have
Also
a Holocaust law.
In France, they just passed a new
Yeah,
restitution
exactly.
law, actually. Michelle, I'm sorry, we have to come to an end, I'm afraid, but
No
thank
problem.
you so much for bringing.
If people have questions, you can email me on my website.
Perfect.
And I will type it here.
Okay.
And I think this is it.
I'm going to hand things over to.
Oops, wrong link.
To our to our communications officer, Greg Irwin, to let everyone know about our next, it's not quite a reading room, but we have an event again tomorrow. Greg?
We have an event indeed tomorrow. Our colleague Anna Orlant, who I think is maybe also actually in attendance right now, did 2 years of research into the artist and collector Eugen Spiro, many of whom's works were in fact burned at the Jeu de Paume in a night that was documented by Rose Valland and is covered in Michelle's book. Anna's research there's a 500-page case study that was published on the JDCRP website based on the entirety of her report. And she is offering a presentation tomorrow, in fact, at 18 Central European Time or 12 Eastern Daylight Time, where she'll be reviewing the nature of the research. It's titled Stolen Jewish Legacies, The Fate of Eugen Spiro and His Looted Collection. I'm dropping a link for registration in the chat now. It'd be wonderful to have some of you there. And otherwise, then that is it for tonight. Thank you again, Michelle, and thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here.
And thanks to our office, to everyone from JDCRP, but also especially to everyone who's been listening, and many of you who keep coming back to listen to more, because we do believe that through books, not just more academic research, that there's so much more a larger, broader audience can learn about this chapter. And to get the laws passed, we simply need more public support and awareness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.